Hello, everybody. A very warm welcome to all of you. I hope you're well and fine. I'm Anisha Chidgupi, one of the coordinators of the South Asia Working Group, and along with Satvik, we've put together a series of webinars hosting prominent scholars to talk to us about the role of capitalism in either exacerbating or ameliorating our economic problems. Today, we are through to our third session of our Dissecting Capitalism series, Chapter 2. We have with us Professor Saskia Sassen, and she will be talking to us on expulsions, the rise of extractive logics in our economies and societies. Welcome, Professor Sassen, and we are thrilled to have you with us, and hope you also enjoy our company in interacting with us. I now request Satvik to introduce our speaker formally. Over to you.
Thank you, Anisha. Thank you very much. It's a real honor to introduce Professor Saskia Sassen. She doesn't really need any introduction, but still, Professor Sassen is Robert S. Lynd Professor of Sociology and co-chairs the Committee on Global Thought at the Columbia University. She has written many books. Each of them are path-breaking. And her books have been translated in 21 languages. She's currently working on When Territory Exit Existing Frameworks under contract with Harvard University Press. She contributes regularly to OpenDemocracy and Huffington Post. Professor Sassen, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Well, it's a great pleasure to have this opportunity, especially because you're also young. I like talking to the new generations rather than my generation, but I also still like the old generation, okay? I really believe in that. So one way of beginning to talk about this is to sort of argue. It's an argument, so it can be changed, it can be altered. I don't think we have the ultimate examination of our current epoch. That will take a bit more time. But I would say that current global age that took off in the 1980s, that is quite a while ago, has really succeeded at unsettling many of the major social, economic, etc. elements that we were debating, that we had debating for a lot. Some of you were not born at that time, but for us, the elders. So one way in which I like to approach this is to argue that we need to de-theorize some of our, innovations, etc., in order to re-theorize. In other words, we cannot simply accept earlier examinations and analyses and just let them sit there. We must engage them. We must return to some of those older analyses that will also predict some of the supposedly futures that were emerging. And we need to see what was it that we thought at that time. Now, you're all very young, but so I lived through an epoch which understood many of the elements in play a bit differently from how we do that now. And I think that this is a positive. That means that different generations and different epochs, it's not just about people, it's also about epochs, they see things differently. And I think we often overlook that, and we shouldn't. Nor should we assume that whatever the older theory said was necessarily wrong, or what we are saying now is necessarily wrong or necessarily perfect. So one way in which I sort of like to start with this is this notion that the current global age that took off in my reading, not everybody has to agree with that, but I repeat, the current global age that took off in the 1980s, in other words, quite a while ago, but that marks the emergence of this new epoch, has unsettled, that emergence, that thing that begins, that condition that begins to emerge in the 1980s, has actually unsettled many of the major social, economic, etc., elements that we had developed. And one way in which I like to think about it is to say that we need to de-theorize in order to re-theorize. And out of that comes revisiting of both older analytic modes and newer ones that for many of us may be sort of barely in the making. Now, my concern is particularly, in my case, is particularly with the major categories we are using in the social sciences, whether that is economy, polity, society, justice, inequality, states, globalization, immigration, more or less, that's a pretty long list as it is. Now, these are all powerful categories that explain much about the realities they represent and represented. However, those realities have mutated. Changes have happened. They're not always visible. We don't necessarily see them with our eyes. They're much more complex than that. They can insert themselves, these new modes of thinking, these new modes of analyzing, can easily insert themselves in existing methodologies. Now, I'm not saying that that's bad. I'm saying the opposite. I'm saying that that is part of what is happening. That is part of this current period. So we are living now in a period where we can work with a very, very big amount of all kinds of issues, analyses, etc. Why? Because if you go back a bit, if you go back to the time, especially in the West, when the wars were on, right? The big wars in the 1950s, also in the 90s, and further later on, we saw it all differently. We made analytics that were different from what had been there. Today, like 30 years later, it's the same thing. We are making new analytics. We may be using often the same instruments, but we are seeing the world through different vectors, if you want. Now, what I'm talking about really are a whole series of powerful categories that explain, I repeat, much about the realities they represent. In other words, these are categories that really tell you something. They're not just sitting there pretty. They're not just a possibility. They're actually categories that we're using in our analytics. Now, I should emphasize that I speak as a person from the West, right? And you speak from another part of the world. And those differences are important. They're interesting. We want to know those differences. We do not want to camouflage or to say, well, it's all the same. No, it isn't. Different parts of the world are undergoing diverse conditions. It's not all the same. Now, what I'm talking about here is really about very powerful categories that explain much about the realities they represent. And I want to emphasize this language of the realities that these categories contain and what they represent. So, however, it gets complicated. Those realities keep mutating. They're not just sitting there pretty all the time the same. They mutate. And so this is another little element. And we need to discover what these major categories veil or obscure, hide about our epoch, precisely because they're powerful. If they were not powerful, we didn't need to bother, really. Now, in my own work, I have really sought to show that the national and the global are powerful categories that hide as much as they reveal about our current epoch. So I repeat, so that for me, that the national and the global are powerful categories that hide, in other words, what we cannot see, that hide as much as they reveal about our current epoch. And so does their mutual exclusivity, because we're dealing with multiple categories. Each is a bit different. So we exist, our practices, our ways of thinking, that those exist in already very complex mixes. By complex, I do not mean simply something that is very, very complicated. I mean that there is a certain kind of complexity, but we can understand that complexity very often, not always, but very often. So in my own work, as I was saying, I have sought to show that the national and the global are powerful categories, I repeat, that hide as much as about our epoch. And so does their mutual exclusivity, because a lot of these categories are really different. It's not always the same story. And yet, even all those different conditionalities can both be affected by a very generic condition. I hope that I'm making myself clear. Now, a second key move in my reading is to exit, to escape, if you want, the knowledge silos. I call them knowledge silos. You know, I hope that that language is clear for you. That means incredible concentrations that are more or less always the same. So I think of these silos, you know, and you have multiple silos. The way you think in your country is going to be different from the way I think in my country, et cetera, et cetera. And these silos have generated, in my reading, over 50 or more years of research in the social sciences. And now I'm talking especially about the West. So I don't know, and I would be very curious how that works in your country. Now, going now into something more sort of an older moment to arrive at this current moment, among the strong patterns of the post-1980s period in Western economies. And I emphasize Western economies because I think in your country, the timing that marked a difference is of a different time. You know, it's a different timing, and I would love to hear from you what it is. So I repeat, among the strong patterns of the post-1980s period in Western economies is a mix of economic and political vectors that are marked by extractive logics. In other words, extractive logics represent, yes, often fantastic intelligences, but they also can be extractive. Mining is the ultimate example. When you mine, no matter how nice and how well you do your mining, by the time you are done mining, you have eliminated something that existed before you started the mining. You understand what I'm saying, right? So these are all sort of little details that mark also how, in my reading, we have to begin to think about our research, our work, in ways, you know, that are a bit more open to diversities than we do. And I say that for the West, the East, the South, the North. And what it really means for me is that we need to recognize how destructive we can be, and to what extent can we recover some of what was destroyed, or at least initiate innovations that allow us to do better, you know, on this new moment, if you want. Now, the rise of such, I repeat, the rise of such extractive logics is partial. And I repeat, but sufficiently powerful to have altered key features of our economies. And here I want to give you some examples. For instance, when mass consumption is the shaping sector of our economies, which it was in the West, in our West, until about the 1980s. That's a long time ago. Even the nastiest corporation in that time, even those corporations that were really aggressive, etc., wanted the sons and daughters to do better than their parents. So they would consume more. And they supported government initiatives that transferred money to households directly and indirectly. This happened in many places, not across the whole world, but in many countries. This began to change. This is the important point now. This all began to change when we began to privatize, to deregulate, and to enable the rise of extractive sectors. Sectors, in other words, like mining, which if you're going to use them, you're going to take out something that will not go back. It won't exist anymore. So you extract, and then that's it. And then you have to find another site for extraction. You know what I'm talking about, right? Now, in many ways, there was a sort of the governments, there was an epoch, especially in the Americas and in England, etc. There was an epoch when the government initiatives really transferred money to households directly and indirectly. And this, I already repeated this began to change with the privatizations, the deregulations, and the rise of finance and financialization in the 1980s. In other words, in the West, and I would love to hear what your side of the story says, that in the West, we really began to change a lot of elements. And they may have at the time looked like great innovations, fantastic, etc., etc. But they also were destructive. And we know that now. So when mass consumption, I repeat, is the shaping sector of our economies, which was until about the 1980s in the West, and I don't know about your country, but up till then, even the nastiest corporations wanted the sons and daughters to do better. I want you to remember that line, to do better than their parents. So they would consume more and supported government initiatives that transferred money to households directly and indirectly. In other words, this was an epoch which was really a new beginning in the West, of our economies, etc. The wars were over, etc. And there was a real interest in making everything better. Well, that in the United States, for instance, lasted only so long. So good intentions, and then became the epoch that I think of as grabbing, taking, not enabling. Now, again, and this sort of begins to change with the privatizations, deregulations, and all kinds of other mechanisms that enabled the big financial firms, but did not necessarily enable little modest firms or communities or even cities. It was really about money. Money became power. Money meant that all kinds of other things could be done. And they were done, some very well and beautifully and very good things, and others not at all. Now, so one way of putting it, really, all of this, is to emphasize the extractive quality, the extractive character of the leading economic sectors. I don't know if extracting is a clear element for you, please phrase, but it really means that you are taking out. And when you're done taking out, there is not much left. No. So one way of putting it is to emphasize the extractive character of leading economic sectors. That in a country like the United States, in the Americas in generally, that keeps going on. This is something that is very alive, etc. Other parts of the world have been a bit more gentle, a bit more, equalized, if you want. Now, here's a question, a question that is a bit of a provocation. How did Google, the famous Google, make its first billion so fast? I mean, they just made that first billion. A billion is a lot of money. And they made it incredibly fast. And so unencumbered, I mean, absolutely by all kinds of traditional constraints. In other words, they avoided all the typical constraints that firms would be subject to. And this is a very important. And so the question then is, one question also is, how did Google make its first billion so fast and so unencumbered by all kinds of traditional constraints? And I want you to remember that question. Now, so I want to argue that this is one instance of an extractive logic. I hope that this was clear, because to me this is very important and it is often overlooked. We think that if it's beautiful If it delivers, that is fine. It has done its job. But when you begin to add the notion of extracting means taking away, taking out. It won't go back. You've lost something. Now, it might be a tiny, modest city. It might be, a whole range of other things. But it is an extraction. Something is lost in that moment. Now, in the case of Google, just to come back to that, Google managed to get information about all of us freely. Didn't have to pay anything to get information about what the grown-ups in a city like New York wanted. Nothing. It didn't. It could just freely find out what that was. So it got information about all of us for free, and then sold it to businesses. They made an enormous amount of money on that mode. They didn't have to do anything, basically. So these are moments that we cannot forget. Otherwise, we fool ourselves about what are the beautiful things that the new economies produced. Yes, it did that, but it also extracted. Now, so I want to argue that this is one instance of extractive logics, as I already said. To me, this is a very important issue, this notion of how we are today living with systems that extract. They don't just extract from the earth or from water, they also extract from people. But everything is within the law, and that makes it even more complicated. So I like to focus on this kind of subject, particularly on finance, high finance, and its sharp differences from traditional banking. Traditional banking was basically commerce. It sold something it had. What we see today, high finance, is totally different. And many people don't realize that. When a financial firm moves into a sector of the economy, which until then has been the hands of sort of traditional enterprises, that entry by a powerful actor is going to destroy some of those modes of doing work, which are to the advantage of the city, which are to the advantage of the people who are modest, etc. That is what this very powerful new set of elements that we have invented makes possible. I'm hoping that I'm clear here on all of this. Now, a second aspect that I also would like to emphasize is the extent to which our major categories of analyses do not help us to track the trajectories of that which is expelled. When something ceases to exist, say where before there were a lot of small little firms in some neighborhood, and they are then eliminated by one big enterprise that comes and does all of that, but it's just one enterprise. When that happens, there really is a kind of expelling and expulsion of all kinds of little enterprises and entrepreneurs, etc. We, the people, lose something every time that happens. And that is sad, and that needn't be that way. And in a somewhat older past, it wasn't that way. So to a large extent, these categories, these new types of categories, were developed at a time when mass consumption was dominant, and more people and households became part of that mass consumption logic. But since the 1980s, that is quite a while ago also, this dominance of mass consumption weakened. And that was a loss for us, the people. When we had vast firms that all did a lot of consumption stuff that we all need, etc., that the people need, that is very different from bringing in very fancy firms that are about totally different notions. And the only time that people matter is when it's very, very expensive elements. So to a large extent, these categories were developed at a time when mass consumption was dominant and more people and households became part of that mass consumption logic. That's the good part. But since the 1980s, this dominance of mass consumption weakened, and another logic became dominant. And that has to do very much with the financializing of as many entities, etc., that could be financialized. That was like a revolution. I mean, most people didn't notice it as a revolution. What they noticed is, wow, something has changed. Something is far more expensive. Something is no longer simple as I used to buy it. Something is now all kinds of rules and this and that and that. Now, I don't know if you have had that experience, but it is actually somewhat unsettling. So there is a book which is called Expulsions, my book, Expulsions, where I have sort of developed a lot about this, how this other set of intelligences, if you want, moved into all kinds of domains, not all of them, but many, all kinds of domains, which were really problematic. They were really problematic for people to understand. Now, I want to make sure, are you hearing me? Yes? Fine,
yes,
okay.
Loud and clear.
Okay, fantastic. Now I want to just move to the level of cities and talk a bit about that. So one way of putting it is that cities are at the forefront of a range of global governance challenges. Also, the application of technological innovations in complex settings is something that is to a large extent happening in cities. And at the same time, there are novel types of economies and politics that are both formal and some are informal that are also rising. As a result of all of these combinations, of major actors, in other words, not the little actor, not the little seller that we are all familiar with from our towns, etc. These are all major actors that are then going to enter our systems and change them and make them more modern, etc., but also the benefits are maximized for those actors, not for us. So we lost something. Yes, we gained excellent, new ways of doing our analyses and I don't know what, of building, etc. But at the same time, it was the big enterprises that were the gainers. They really won, not the people, not the little firms. The little firms that had existed for a long time and did fine. They could not survive against these very powerful actors. Now, coming then back to this whole question of the city, just that, let's remember what I just said, but we enter, so cities in today's world, that was not always the same. It was not always. Cities are today at the front of a whole range of global governance challenges, and also at the application of technological innovations in complex settings, not little simple things, but complex settings, and also novel types of economies and politics, both formal and informal, because the informal exists not only in the shape of, say, poorer and modest enterprises, it also exists as channels that allow the big firms to be in connection, very easy connection, not a controlled connection, but just connection with other parties at the other side of the world, if you want, or at the other side of the, of the ocean from where they are. And that then strengthened even more the capabilities and the vastness of the domain that these emergent, very powerful actors eventually represented. It took the people, us, a while to understand that that was happening. Now, so here again, back to something more generic, when I say that cities are at the forefront of a range of global governance challenges. The application of technological innovations in complex settings, and novel types of economies and politics, both formal and informal. So I'm giving you three elements here. Global governance challenges, you know, with all these transformations and all these innovations, there was change. Then the application of technological innovations in complex settings, and again, complexity is dominant. And number three, novel types of economies and politics. That's a big deal, to reinvent elements of the political, you know, and of the economic. Now, as a result of all of this, many of today's major global governance challenges become concrete, urgent, and practical in the major cities that we have worldwide. So the major cities go through a change because they become major actors in a way that they had not been before. And this is an important point to remember, because we take our big cities for granted now. They are the centers of power, etc. But there was a time when supposedly it was the national government that was the most powerful actor, etc. Well, many national governments sort of sank a bit in importance and power because there were these other actors, private actors, who knew exactly what they wanted, who knew how to extract value from all kinds of situations. I'm hoping, am I explaining myself? Can you all understand me? Yes, no problems?
Yes,
okay,
very
fantastic.
clearly. I mean, the Q&A session will tell us how engaging it was. Yeah, please.
Okay. Now let me, now an element of capturing this switch is also that when we think of what did national states offer their countries in a fairly recent past, it was quite different from what they offer in today's world. And so in this sort of changing and globalized landscape, cities and networks of cities, listen to this, cities and networks of cities become far more important than they were, for instance, in the immediate post-World War II decades, when national states and the interstate system gained prominence and developed multiple agreements. Let's remember that national states are there to be the most powerful actors, but in many ways they have lost ground. And part of the losing of ground went connected with what I was just describing to you all in terms of how cities developed, etc., etc. So these are really significant transformations that are not always sort of remembered or mentioned by people. They think the city is the city, the country is the country. It's much more complicated than that. Now, just to focus, since this is part of the subject that you're interested in, to focus on the whole question of urban conditions and global challenges, especially those that concern power and powerlessness. There, I would say that of particular concern in that case are the environment, the global and local economies, decaying and new types of urban infrastructures. You know, the cities, because all these new cities that we have built, you know, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, many of them are beginning to decay, especially in the poorer areas. The rich areas always know how to protect themselves. But we are a bit in a crisis, in a housing crisis, in a crisis because of the high costs of housing. So something has changed very seriously in the housing situation. There was a time when housing was not such an expensive entity as it is today. And that is something that we cannot forget. And we must, I would argue, fight against it. We should not let it be that way. Now, one element in play there, which is of course of particular concern, is the whole question of the environment. To that we can add the global and the local economies. I already touched on that. The whole notion of the decaying of certain conditions and the rise of new types of urban infrastructures, especially important, of course, in cities, but the urban infrastructures are, a country needs urban infrastructures throughout, or at least, the trucks that are the equivalent, if you want. Now, the other major issues, of course, that our cities are confronting more and more are racisms of all sorts, new types of inequalities, new types of formal and informal political actors and initiatives, emerging intercity networks that have their own special sort of little worlds. And I would argue that in today's epoch, I don't know how long it will last, and it wasn't always this way, but in today's epoch, it is the city, as I already said, that is far more dominant than the country as a whole. So some countries have known to valorize those cities to the highest level, and they make a lot of money from their own cities. Other countries have not been so successful, right? And so you see the cities often in quite severe decay, and the points of power and innovation in sort of these new types of buildings and setups that we're seeing growing throughout the world. What is interesting is, notwithstanding all of this stuff, all these transformations, cities are, in fact, the sites, the places for new types of formal and informal political actors and initiatives. And that is something that is sort of important. Now, how much more time do I have? I don't want to talk too long.
10 minutes is fine, 10, 15 minutes.
Okay, very good. Now, when you look at classical texts on cities, the sort of an older epoch, which was a bit simpler in many ways than our current epoch, but then you can sort of begin to understand how cities have been able to live such long lives. You understand that cities, I want everybody to know this, most of you know that already, cities appeared long before national countries in that kind of level. So that is very interesting. There were cities already, millennia in the past. That is quite amazing. And so today, the invitation is a bit to think, well, what has happened with a city? What all have cities lost? But then also, what all have cities added? What are the things where they really they are still contributing in very significant ways? Now, I have a set, I thought somehow I was going to be able to show you some of the list of papers that I have here, but I don't think that will work. So I just want to conclude with one sort of little element that I really care about, which is the whole question of urban global space. So yes, urban, but global space. And two actors that are critical in that, in my reading, this is my way of thinking, are global cities and global slums. Both are growing throughout the world. We see a lot of fantastically luxurious new sort of global cities with lots of luxury and all of that. And we see a lot of global slums. I call them global slums because really the ways in which they survive and what all they have to do, the people who live in those slums, represents a form of knowledge that is impressive. They have far fewer tools than we all have, far fewer options. And they have invented modes of making sure that this little plant can keep on growing, that this little piece of water can be kept clean, that an effort that is daily work, etc., in many, many of our major cities across the world. And that is a lot of cities. Many more cities in the world than there are countries. So how people are connected to cities. People know how to handle the city. People know when something goes wrong, much more so than whatever the intelligentsia at the top, which if nothing is broken, then they don't have to bother with it. So I have one of my famous subjects, and I call it Deciphering the Global Slum. In other words, by using the term deciphering, I'm trying to really say that slums are also, they have their own complexities, and they're not always self-evident. And I leave you with this, and I would like you to remember what I said, that that the slum is for many people a very good and workable situation. Of course, we wish that nobody had to live in a slum, but slums are not only sites of disasters and of war, of using guns, etc. No, there are multiple types of slums, and they enable a lot of people to actually still be alive. And so I just wanted to leave you with that notion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor, for that enlightening talk. We already have questions pouring in. So but first, let me just pose my question or something like my comment. So you have mentioned something like the cities are becoming more central, like power concentrated areas. So in our experience in India, earlier in the 1960s and 70s, when the Congress government under the prime ministership of Indira Gandhi was more focused on the rural sector, saying that we want to eradicate poverty, bring in more food, provide more food to the people, like something like that. But now, cut to 2020s, you have another national political party, which is now focusing more on cities, saying that we're going to give you free electricity, free water, because now they know they can only come to power when they focus on giving these facilities to cities and the residents. So it's very much evident when you look at the global south also, that there has been a movement from appeasing the rural, the country, to appeasing the people who reside in the cities, because they know that only when they do that can they come into power. So more than benefiting the people, it's like a vicious circle of trying to remain in power. So in some way, powerful people always want more power, and there is no end to it. And we see that happening across the world.
Yes.
With that, I think I will request, we have a question from Mr. Khan, Danish, yes. So you could unmute yourself and ask your question. Yes, go ahead.
Hi, Professor Sassen. It was wonderful to listen to you, and it's really amazing. So again, building on your talk, you brilliantly describe extractive logic, in which it seems like capital tends to be more interested in acquiring land and natural resources in the global south rather than hiring wage labor and extract surplus value in that traditional Marxian sense, the way we understand. So two questions, I think, partly. One, do you see any functional role of what the surplus population from the perspective of capital in processes of capital accumulation? And B, how you see your theory of expulsions and extractive logic in the broader Marxian political economy framework, where some critics would argue now we're moving away from focusing on extraction of surplus value from labor to looking more at land and other natural resources. And this is a critique I have encountered as well as building on your work. So that's why I wanted to put to you that same question.
No, good questions. But so when I talked about expulsions, I was really trying to capture the ease with which in a big city where people also know each other, et cetera, how easy it is to push out the ones you don't want, especially if they're modest. That to me is just a striking fact. and the extent to which the lower income people are forced to live further and further away from their jobs. You know, that there is a whole combination of elements there that generates for me the strong negativity. It's not just the workers themselves. It is that they have to travel all these long hours, and they never sleep enough, and so they die young, and et cetera, you know, and that in our advanced societies, so-called advanced societies, like the United States, that we should still be dealing with that level, you know, that level of sort of exploitation is to me sort of not acceptable. You know, I want to contest that. I want to say that is, and of course, all municipal governments we know are in trouble. None of them have the money they need. Well, you know what? We should address that and not say, oh, because we don't have the money we need, we cannot help the poor. Hell no, we have to help both the poor and the municipal entities that are trying to do good work. So there is something that is really flawed. And especially, I'm thinking especially about the United States. You know, I grew up in the Netherlands. I'm Dutch. The Dutch, they are entrepreneurial. They want to make money, et cetera, et cetera. But by God, has any of you lived in the Netherlands? They really take care that everything is comme il faut, you know, that everything is working as it should. Could the United States also do that? They have enough money. Yes, they do. But they will not spend that money on people who have no voice. I mean, it really is about the people who do not have voice, the way they have been disappeared from too many situations. And that is sort of what, you know, now the question of expulsions is broader than just that. And one of the issues in play for me was, when I used the term expulsions, is what we don't see. You know, as I think I alluded to that already. What we don't see, it's quite a bit what we don't see. And so I was doing some project, and then I happened to fall into a sort of situation where that was happening. And that to me is very interesting. It can be very negative, but it can also be positive. You know? The notion that we accept that there are many things, we may walk past it every single day, but we don't see it. Or what we don't see, when you begin to think that way, you realize it's a very broad spectrum of good things, bad things, all kinds of things that we don't see. And I find that like a little, and then I immediately wonder, epochs, do different epochs come with different modalities when it comes to what we don't see? You know, is it true that 30 years ago, when the cities were smaller, etc., did we see more about the city than we see now? Or is it just the other way around? We saw less. I don't know that. But those are sort of questions that keep me not awake, I won't say that, but keep me entertained. Now, I don't know if you have any comments on that, but.
Okay, so Danish, if you want to cross question, maybe I'll give you time later, but we will first get questions from Edelweiss and Francisco in that order.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Saskia. A very inspiring talk. I'm sorry I can't turn on my camera because I'm not really comfortable. I'm really interested in your talk on the epoch issues, because I can also clearly feel there's a huge transition after the 1980s. And since now it has been like 30 or 40 years, do you have any idea on how long this epoch will last? And in what circumstances this epoch will end? For example, would technological advance result in the end? Or do we need economic crisis like the oil crisis in the 1970s to show the limit of the capitalism and to find new ways to do this kind of economy? So yeah, that's basically my question. Thank you.
You know, it is, quite a few years ago, I thought that by now, I'm still alive here, you know, I thought that by now, not only would I be dead, but that something would have changed quite a bit in the world. But it hasn't. And so the question I have is, are we stuck? Have we lost the will to reinvent? Have we, et cetera, et cetera? What is happening? We know about, the rich are doing fine and some of the poor are doing worse. We know all of those negatives that many cities have. But I think there is something else in play, and I can't quite have a full understanding of what it is, but I have the sense that we have entered a new epoch. And as I said already before, I think in complex systems, and we are dealing with complex systems, it is not easy to understand that change has happened. I mean, I find I barely have a sense of change, and I've been in this world for quite a long time, but I know that I'm fooling myself when I think that way, because there are so many conditions that I never encounter, but that if I encountered them, I would know, oh my God, this is really different. And there are two extremes: the very, very poor, the forgotten poor, I mean, the super poor, and the enormous advances that are happening, in terms of our innovations. So we are I think this epoch that we're living is sort of in an in-between period that may last, 30 years. I mean, it already has lasted that long and might last a bit longer. But I don't know that. What we know from long histories is that stuff moves, it changes. It does not stay always in the same situation. It changes, it alters. But how it will change, who will be the losers? There were epochs when the change meant that more and more of the poor could have a house, they could eat enough. Today, my inclination is to think that would not be so much part of that suddenly the poor can eat as the food that they need to eat. I don't have that sense at all. I think we will be seeing growing numbers of people, but within that growth of which, with many good situations, et cetera, we will also see more and more poor people. We are already seeing that in our major cities in the United States. We are already seeing that. Are we seeing that in Paris? Paris has it's a very big city, very well organized. Much less than in the United States, we see poverty there. And supposedly the United States is far richer than France. So, the ways in which our leaderships have emerged and have grown and have decided to understand what is going on varies from country to country. And I would say in the United States, where I live now, though right now I am in London, okay, but the United States, to me, has both some very good things, but it also is one of the most brutal of the rich cities in the world. When I see what the Dutch do, I'm Dutch, right? What the Dutch do with the poor, it's not that they simply give them money. They really try to bring them into the situation, etc. The Netherlands is a very small country and it has a lot of foreigners. And many of the foreigners come from countries where the United States, for instance, would not want them. And so it really varies enormously. And there, I think that it is interesting to look at cities from the worst to the best, because it really shows what can be done and what can also be simply forgotten or not done. Okay, I'm beginning to give you a second lecture, but I want to stop that. Any other questions, or are we ready to get our drinks, so to say, if we
have
were
3
all
more
together?
No,
We have 2 more, if you have time.
Okay, yes, of course.
What we can do is collect all the 3 questions and then you can answer them all together.
Okay.
Maybe there will be overlap in those questions. So first I'll invite Francisco, and then Simjay can go ahead, and the last one by Roy, I think. Yeah. So you can pose the questions together, one after the other, and then it can be collectively answered.
Okay. Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
How are you? Thank you, Saskia, for such a wonderful lecture. Thank you guys for organizing it. I come from Argentina in Latin America, and I wanted to.
Yo también
yes.
soy de ahí.
Lo sé, lo sé, lo sé.
Muy bien, muy
Salud.
bien.
Salud.
Salud.
Yes, I know that, and I'm very glad of being here. So thank you. My question is about extractivism, because as you know, here in Latin America, extractivism was and is not only a political, economic strategy, but also an electoral strategy, and even unfolded by progressive governments and parties. So, which is paradoxical. My question is, here, extractivism is presented as a sort of trade-off between progress or development or poverty, right? Like, okay, we should conserve the climate and try to have environmental policies which are progressive, but we have to develop as well, and we have to extract for that. We have to extract in order for the economy to thrive. Yes. And that's the narrative we have here. And I've been watching this in a live version, maybe, but it's still there in my government and governments from the region, and even worse with the Belt and Road Initiative from China. So the question I have is, what do you think, and what are your thoughts about this sort of trade-off narrative that we are presented with?
Right.
Thank you.
Okay, those are very important points also for me in my work. So one first point I would like to make.
Sorry to cut you in. Professor, I'll just cut you in. I will just collect the questions. It will give you more time.
Okay.
Simjay, why don't you pose yours? Try to make it short and to the point.
I will try my best. Thank you. Thank you very much for the talk, and thank you very much for the organizers to make it possible. So my question might be a little bit more high level. I hope you find it relevant as well. But while I was listening to your presentation, I was also thinking about digitalization a lot, because I'm an urban planner, but in the last 5 years, I'm working mainly on urban computing, social data, and how we can use it in favor of citizens. And currently I am working in a project related to data privacy. So while thinking all about my current work, I can see many parallelism between this pace of digitalization and what you talked about since 1980s. So I can see the extraction, mass consumption, and governmental challenges, financialization, etc. So my question is, what do you think are the concrete effects of this new order of digitalization and this pace of digitalization, so to say, in urban economies in general? Or what do you think the effects will be? I mean, we can see the effects in social level more clear, it's clearer, but I mean, I really wonder your opinion regarding the economical aspect. Thank you.
No, this is a very good, can you hear me? Yes? You can hear me? Okay. Yeah, no, this is a very good question. I have often asked myself that same question. It would take so little, and I'm talking now about the United States because other countries have done it, like the Netherlands or the French. It would take so little, really, from here in the United States, from our, whoever the entities that control a city, to enable the poor, but they don't do it. So we have most poor people either are on these very, very old systems, that are just falling apart and that move slowly. But instead of enabling, you look at the Germans or the Dutch, and they have enabled everybody who lives there. They don't have to, whether they're rich or poor, they get that. It is just it's a constitutive element of us, the citizens. And that is what I think is deeply missing in the Americas. I also find the Americas, that doesn't mean everything and everybody, but a very significant portion of the people and the projects, etc. I find it a bit brutal. You know, I lived in Argentina and I lived in the Netherlands. And I would say the Netherlands, little country, Argentina, big, very rich country, brutal. You're either rich or you're poor, and that's that. In the Netherlands, everybody has access to the at least the most basic of, you know, connectivity issues. And so those things make me think, and I will never give up naming those who are the grabbers and who don't do anything. You know, I think that that is a battle that has to be fought, you know, whenever one has an opportunity. But I don't know if I'm answering your question here. I'm sorry. The computational digitization and data privacy, right? That is what you were talking about? Yes, I'm sorry. I just took off in a different direction. Well, I mean, the data privacy has been already subjected across the years with some objections, and, you know, they have done a few things better, etc. I personally, I'm okay with how it all works. I know that there are real problems, certainly for certain types of actors, but I'm not sufficiently of an expert on, you know, what is really wrong and what hampers the work of certain types of people, given how the system functions. So I don't know enough about that kind of situation to know that, are they doing it well or bad? What I do know is that in many countries in Europe, the systems are far more open than they are in the Americas. I don't know where you are. Where are you?
I'm from Turkey, but currently I'm living in Germany for a while now.
In Germany. Okay, Germany also, you know, it's just different. In the United States, we still have, most poor people have very elementary types of connections that belong to the invention, you know, of 40 years ago, something like that. That to me is simply an abuse. That it should not be happening. You know, we should all have, even if it is very minimal for some and very big for others, but everybody should have access to the minimal stuff that you need in order to call the police, to call a doctor, whatever, you know, all these other systems that are in play. Just putting it in those terms rather than thinking, okay, kids playing. No, just basic stuff that we all deal with. Is this an answer to your question or not quite?
Yeah, I mean, the part that I wonder is how this affect the urban economics. But yeah, I mean, I can relate still your comments on it.
Yes. No, but it's just amazing. The United States, for instance, the very rich cities, but still a lot of people in our big American cities do not have good access. You know, they have very elementary, very old-fashioned often access. Is that necessary? Well, yes, in a country, if you have to buy whatever you need, and the system refuses to generate, you know, new circumstances, etc., and participate in that transformation. And that is what we have in the US. The US is very problematic on that. It's all about money. If you don't have money, you're out. And that's not right. Okay.
Professor, I will redirect you to Francisco's question earlier on China's presence and the Belt and Road Initiative. So maybe you would want to touch upon that.
Yeah. Well, China, who am I talking to? Okay. So China is, for me, a very interesting. I've spent a lot of time in China, actually. And I was impressed with how they put in all the systems, you know, that were necessary for people, etc., given the reputation that they also have of being control freaks, as we say in some countries. I mean, like the United States. So I find China more sympathetic, I confess. Many of my friends don't like it at all. Then I do some of the practices that we see in the United States, which is a rich country, you know. And China has done well with roads, with bridges, with the internet bit, you know, it has sort of enabled its people in a way that in the United States, you have to do it on your own, or the big enterprises do it, not the government. The government of China has delivered for its people on some of these issues. Are they perfect? Of course not. Are the Dutch perfect? No, they're not either, you know. So these are, I don't know, I always think that the new generations, that is you young, will succeed in changing it. It's already happening, I would say. That, you know, there is a great, but certainly in some countries like the Netherlands, where I was born, they immediately opened it up to everybody. You know, the notion that this would be a private thing, that only if you had the money to buy the whatevers, no, unacceptable. And that is what the United States is so stuck on. It's so stuck on money. Even when it has plentiful of money, and money is not, I would understand a poor country where really, if they want to do anything like help health issues, whatever, that they need money and they don't have it. But the United States, they have a hell of a lot of money. So to me, those are in the long term not going to be situations that will be admired by future generations.
All right, Roy, you've been waiting for long. You can ask your question.
Okay, Roy, where are you?
Hi, hello.
Okay, hello.
Hi, thank you so much, Professor, for your presentation. I was just curious, and I'll make it brief. Some of these things we talk about them in terms of systemic or structural changes, but many times especially since all of the extraordinary policies that we saw launched around COVID and fighting the pandemic, I wonder if it's just a matter of political will and political imagination in many cases. Of course, local authorities are constrained by mostly money, fiscal capacity, but yeah, I'm wondering, since you're a person with you know, such a wide experience also with discussing with officials and sitting down and talking to people, what do you think about this? Whether we just sometimes we do lack will and imagination to solve some of these key problems in our cities and towns?
Yeah, I think what you said is actually right. I think it's just a lack of will. And not always, but in many situations, it is simply that they say, okay, we have done what we have done, and that's enough. You know, and that at many different levels. This is not just in the municipal governments. So I just often, and of course, those who suffer then are not the ones who spoke that. Those who suffer are the ones who then miss out on things. So, number two, I cannot understand why many of the rich countries are unwilling to put in money to raise the quality of life for poor neighborhoods. I don't understand that. And it has to do with, they see those poorer people as not having power, and so why bother? And I find that also highly problematic, that mode of thinking. In the long run, that will create negatives. Whereas if you do it all, you know, there's some countries like my country, the Netherlands, you know, it's not like they're saints. They're absolutely not saints. They are commercially oriented, etc., etc. But by God, they want that country to function. And when they say that, they mean the whole country. Admittedly, it's a very little country. So that makes it a bit easier to do it. But still, I think, you know, I just really think that I really object to countries that do not take care of their more disadvantaged communities. I think that is unacceptable in today's world, especially because many of those countries have plenty of money to do some very nice things. They could also spread it more broadly. I don't know if I answered your question, but.
Yes, thank you.
All right, we'll take one more. That is by Asli. If you'd like to unmute yourself and pose the question.
Hello.
Hello.
My question is more on the cultural side of the things. Like you mentioned, in the 20th century, we have seen the mass consumerism and financialization acting with similar but different extractive logics. And when we go back earlier in the century, we have seen total state rescalings. I was wondering,
total what? I didn't understand that. Total
like nation states proliferating.
nation states. Okay, yeah.
So, and now we have this urban global space, and where do you see the cultural decay brought about by this extractive logic? And the related question is that, would you see the social cohesion or global governance discussions can be reframed by using older notions, like when, as you mentioned, towns are quite older. So we were talking about cosmopolitanism when we are analyzing earlier centuries. Do you see a link that we can utilize some of the older knowledge into nowadays context?
Yes, I am sure that there are older knowledges that could be very helpful today. They're helpful not just in terms of reading it and saying, oh, we could also do this, but also in the sense that whoever is in charge of the city, you know, the police, the many different actors that are in charge, that they recognize, aha, the people are unhappy. The people think that we should do more. You know, the fact that there are manifestations, you know, the fact that some key members of a community begin to complain, all of that, I think that is part of how a city functions. And the law must accept, the law says that you must accept that the citizens come with complaints. You can't just, throw them out. And at the same time, if there is a poor community that has a devastating, catastrophic water situation, the municipality should act on that. Now, what I notice, which worries me, that for instance, in the United States, many people don't know the rights that they have, the rights to go to the local municipality and say, this has been broken for 3 years, please fix it. My children are getting very ill, whatever it might be, whatever the reasons. And what makes me sad always when I see that the number of people who don't know what their rights are. It's like in the United States a bit, you feel that we don't talk too much about the elites, the powerful actors don't talk too much about rights, because when they start talking about rights, those rich people, those etc. powerful people are going to, confront the fact that, they could have done something, they could have done something that they didn't do. So, but I think that what is good for a city is to, number one, know your own neighborhood very well, so that that's at least one site that you can talk about, where you will know what is broken, what is working well, etc., etc. So you start with little things. But then my imaginary always wants to think that we could connect, as I said already earlier, right? That we could connect some of the neighborhoods, and that we could connect some of the separate entities to see what can be done. Because many municipalities do not have a lot of money. You see, that is also a fact. If you live in a very rich municipality, it's different, because there the rich probably are also contributing to the money of the municipality to ensure that you get some good, some good results for whatever it is that you need. So I would say that the disadvantaged are at a disadvantage, and the rich do not have a disadvantage. And that is a kind of injustice that we could make a bit less brutal. At least that, we could make it less brutal. We cannot ask for, in today's world, for we should all be the same. There was a moment when we all thought that was an option. We know that is not. But what we can do is say, please fix that, whatever that has been broken and smelly for the last 3 years, or whatever it would be. But the fight has to be fought, you don't want to give up. I think that we as citizens, we should be far more active than we are. And that would make a difference, because I've noticed it whenever I I think that doesn't happen very often for me because I'm always sort of so busy. But when I go to a place and I actually raise a bit of hell, it works. They will fix it. But it also depends on so many other things. What did you have in mind? What do you think?
So I come from Turkey also, and I'm studying right now Istanbul, and we have seen big mobilizations again in Gezi, for example.
Yeah.
But now, as the local municipality voting was like they voted for the government, for the political party that is not the national government, and we see these clashes between like resources being held by the national government, or some projects that need to go through the legislation system being held or wasting some type of time for some betterments. So this type of clashes between the municipal or city level and the nation state is a bit of a concern for me nowadays, to be honest.
Yeah, I see that. Well, it was a great pleasure for me to talk to you all, and you can stay in touch with me. And shall we just call it a day, as they say? Thank you very much.
Okay, I will do that. So you want to leave now? Okay, so we thought.
If you have other questions, I can answer a few more questions. Yes.
Okay, one more. If
one more. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Damu wanted to ask. I'm sorry, I'm using the first name. Where is the question? Are you around? No, she's not. Okay, so. Okay, I can formally end the session, and
okay.
I can also request you to stay 2-3 minutes more if they want to ask something very candidly to you. Thank you very much. It's been a privilege for me as a student of planning, and it's a real honor to have you, and welcome all of you, those who have joined. There will be another session tomorrow with Katharina Pister, who will be talking some of the things Professor Saskin has indicated, that how the laws are manipulated to empower the rich, and how the code of capital is written and rewritten over time. So thank you, Professor Saskia Sassen. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you all. Okay. Bye-bye.